Imagine a river that has seen more stories than any book could ever hold. The Tigris, winding through what is now Iraq, has carried not just water for 5,000 years, but ideas, goods, and the dreams of people who once called its banks home. 5 millennia ago, where its currents carved a gentle curve through limestone hills and fertile plains, a small group of people built their homes. They chose a spot where the river slowed just enough to ford, where the cliffs provided shelter, and where the soil, watered by annual floods, grew grains tall and sweet. This was no grand city, no palace or temple rising to the sky, just a cluster of mud brick houses, huddled like sheep against the wind, their roofs made of reeds and their walls daubed with clay to keep out the rain. The people who lived here were not kings or warriors. They were farmers who sowed barley. In the floodplains, fishermen who cast nets at dawn, and most importantly, traders who watched the river for the first signs of distant caravans. Why here? You might wonder, what made this patch of riverbank special? Stand where they stood, and you'd see. This was a bottleneck. A place where anyone traveling from the highlands of Iran to the markets of the Mediterranean had to cross. Merchants, with donkeys loaded with Anatolian silver, weavers carrying bolts of Mesopotamian cloth dyed indigo and red, herders driving sheep toward richer pastures, all of them had to pause here, to rest, to trade, to drink from the Tigris before continuing. Their journeys dotted first. The settlement was just a convenience. A place to sell a cup of water, a handful of dates, a night's shelter. But the people here were clever. They noticed what the caravans carried. Silver from the mines of Anatolia, bright and heavy. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, blue as the foe. Sky, spices from lands even farther east, their scents sharp and strange. They began to trade, not just in food and shelter, but in information. The silver merchants are asking for more cloth this season. A farmer might tell a weaver. The lapis traders say the mountain passes will close soon, better send your goods now. Slowly, the settlement grew. More houses went up, their walls sharing sides to save space and keep out the cold. A market square formed at its heart, where traders haggled over prices in a dozen dialects. Workshops opened, potters shaping jars to hold olive oil and wine, smiths hammering copper into simple tools and ornaments, weavers creating cloth so fine it would later be prized in distant palaces. But what truly set this place apart was its god. The people called him Ashur after their settlement. Unlike the gods of other Mesopotamian cities, who represented the sun, the moon, or the flood, Ashur was the city itself. He was the limestone cliff where his temple stood, the market, square where deals were struck, the very idea of this community. To honor Ashur was to honor their home. To make Ashur great was to make their own lives secure. Imagine walking through the streets of this early settlement at dusk. A sun dips low, painting the Tigris gold. Smoke curls from cooking fires, carrying the smell of barley bread and roasted fish. A priest climbs the steps of Ashur's temple, a small shrine of mud brick with a wooden roof, to light an offering of incense. Traders from distant lands sit on woven mats, counting silver pieces by the light of oil lamps. A mother calls her children home, their laughter fading as they race past piles of pottery waiting to be loaded onto boats. This was a world of movement. The people here knew the names of distant cities. Ur, with its ziggurat reaching toward the stars. Nineveh, a small town then, not yet the great capital it would become. Hattusa, far to the north, where the Hittites forged iron. They knew the customs of strangers, how the Anatolians preferred to barter rather than use silver. How the Sumerians bowed 3 times when greeting a priest. How the mountain tribesmen drank fermented milk with every meal. Their houses reflected this cosmopolitan spirit. Inside, you might find a Sumerian-style pottery bowl next to a local clay lamp, a necklace of Afghan lapis beside a copper bracelet made by a local smith. The scribes, who learned to write in the cuneiform script borrowed from the south, kept records not just of grain harvests, but of trade deals. 3 bolts of red cloth for 5 pounds of silver, delivered to the merchant from Canish. Witnessed by 2 priests and a fisherman. Yet for all their borrowing, they remained stubbornly themselves. Their temple to Ashur, though small, was built in a style all their own, lower and sturdier than Sumerian temples, with a courtyard where the entire community could gather for festivals. Their weavers, while using Sumerian looms, created patterns that told stories of the Tigris, waves, fish, the curve of the river itself. Even their gods, though they adopted some from the south, always kept Ashur at the center, like a parent, watching over a growing family. By 2000 BCE, this pebble by the Tigris had grown into something remarkable, a trading power. Its merchants didn't just wait for caravans, they traveled with them. They set up outposts in central Anatolia, in a place called Canish, where over 23,000 clay tablets would later be found, documenting deals, partnerships, and even insurance policies. If the caravan is attacked by bandits, the loss will be shared equally by all partners, one tablet reads. If the silver is stolen, the guard will repay double. These Anatolian outposts weren't just stores, they were little pieces of home. The merchants built houses like those by the Tigris, with courtyards and shrines to Ashur. They set up their own courts, where disputes were settled according to the laws of their homeland. Their children grew up speaking both the local language and their parents' tongue, acting as translators and brokers. And every year, ships and caravans carried silver back down the Tigris, filling the settlement's coffers and funding bigger temples, better houses, and more ambitious trade. What drove them? Greed, yes, but something more. They believed Ashur wanted his city to thrive, that his dominion should stretch as far as their caravans could travel. A merchant heading north might pray, "Guide my donkeys, Ashur, and let the silver flow back to your temple." A scribe recording a deal might write, "May Ashur bless this trade, that our city may grow." The leaders of this community, called Ishaku, or stewards, saw themselves as servants of Ashur, not rulers. Their job was to build temples, maintain the market, and keep the trade routes safe. One early leader, Arishamai, boasted in an inscription not of winning battles, but of building Ashur's house and making the trade routes wide and safe for caravans. His son, Ikunum, followed in his footsteps, adding rooms to the temple and negotiating new trade agreements with distant kings. Life here wasn't without hardship. Floods sometimes swept away houses. Droughts parched the fields. Bandits occasionally attacked weak caravans. But the people persisted, bound together by their trade, their faith, and their belief that their little settlement on the Tigris was destined for something greater. As the centuries passed, the settlement's name became synonymous with its people, Assyria. It wasn't an empire, yet not even close. Just a busy, bustling hub where the world came to trade, where ideas mixed like the waters of the Tigris, where a handful of people dared to dream that their pebble by the river might one day make ripples across continents. Can you see them? The merchant counting silver by lamplight, dreaming of new markets. The weaver threading her loom with blue thread, imagining where her cloth might end up. The the priests standing in Ashur's temple, praying for his city to grow. They couldn't have known what their descendants would achieve, but they laid the stones one by one that would someday support a mighty empire. And the Tigris? It kept flowing, as it always had, carrying their goods, their stories, and their hopes toward a future none of them could imagine. The Tigris still flowed, but by 1800 BCE, something had changed in the air above its banks. The whispers of ambition, once faint as breath, were growing louder. In the settlement that now called itself Ashur, a young leader named Shamshi-Adad looked out at the world and saw not just trade routes, but possibilities that would transform a merchant city into something far more formidable. What makes a leader different from those who came before, you might ask? For generations, Assyrian rulers had been content to tend their temples, manage their caravans, and keep the peace. But Shamshi-Adad was not content. He saw weakness in the kingdoms around him, quarreling city-states, fragile alliances, rulers more interested in luxury than power. And he saw strength in his own people, shrewd traders who knew distant lands, scribes who could record and organize, craftsmen who could forge tools and weapons. In 1813 BCE, he took the throne, and the world of Mesopotamia would never be the same. His first move was bold. He didn't just trade with neighboring cities, he conquered them. Mari, a wealthy center on the Euphrates, fell to his armies, its palaces and granaries now flying his standard. He installed his son, Yazma-Adad, as ruler there, creating a network of power that stretched far beyond Ashur's original borders. But Shamshi-Adad was more than a conqueror. He was a builder of systems, not just palaces. Imagine walking into his palace at Mari, 300 rooms spread across acres, each with a purpose. There were throne rooms where foreign ambassadors trembled, archives filled with clay tablets recording every tax collected and every order given, workshops where artisans crafted luxury goods to impress allies and intimidate enemies. In one room, scribes hunched over their tables, copying his commands to be sent to distant governors. Build a road from here to Ashur, one tablet reads. Make sure it's wide enough for 2 carts. Post guards every 10 miles. In another, generals studied maps drawn on leather, planning campaigns with the same precision a merchant might use to plan a caravan route. Attack at dawn, Shamshi-Adad's orders read. Burn their fields, first starve them into submission. This was a new kind of kingdom, not a loose collection of cities, but a state held together by roads, laws, and a professional army. No longer did farmers grab their spears. When trouble came, Shamshi-Adad paid men to fight full-time, training them in formations that could break enemy lines, equipping them with better weapons than any their neighbors had. He also understood the power of ideas. Ashur has chosen me, he declared in his inscriptions, to bring order to the world. This wasn't just bragging. It was a mission. When his armies marched, they weren't just taking land, they were liberating people from chaos, bringing them into the ordered realm of the gods. It was a clever trick, making conquest sound like charity. For a time, it worked. His kingdom stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. Traders still came, but now they paid tribute to him, not just to local rulers. Scribes in distant cities copied his laws, and priests prayed to Ashur in temples he'd built. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant ruler obsessed with detail, ruthless with enemies, and utterly convinced of his divine purpose. But even the brightest stars burn out. When Shamshi-Adad died around 1781 BCE, his kingdom began to crumble. His sons quarreled over power. Governors in distant cities, tired of taking orders from Ashur, declared independence. Mari threw off its yoke under a new ruler, Zimri-Lim, who tore down Shamshi-Adad's statues and wrote poems celebrating his victory over the tyrant. Worst of all, a new power was rising to the south, Babylon, led by a king named Hammurabi. You might remember him from stories about his famous law code, an eye for an eye, and all that. Hammurabi's armies marched north, crushing what was left of Shamshi-Adad's realm. In 1761 BCE, they captured Mari and destroyed Shamshi-Adad's magnificent palace, brick by brick. The message was clear. The age of Assyrian expansion was over. For the next 400 years, Assyria would be a shadow of itself. It paid tribute to Babylon, then to the Mitanni, a warrior people from the north who rode horses and chariots with terrifying skill. Assyrian kings still ruled, but they did so with one eye on their overlords, careful not to anger them. "We are servants of the Mitanni king," one inscription grovels. "May our tribute please him." It would have been easy to disappear, to blend into the empires that swallowed them. But the Assyrians were stubborn. They held on to their identity like a sailor clutching a raft in a storm, not how. By preserving what mattered. Their traders kept moving, even if their caravans were smaller. They still sold textiles and bought silver, maintaining connections that would one day grow strong again. Their scribes kept writing, copying old texts strayed. Records, religious rituals, even Shamshi-Adad's inscriptions in temple schools. "Remember," they taught their students, "we were once great. We will be again." Their priests kept Ashur at the center of their faith. Even when Mitanni gods were honored in public, Ashur's temple remained the heart of the community. "He is waiting," they whispered, "waiting for his people to be ready." And their warriors? They didn't forget how to fight. They hunted in the mountains, practicing with bow and spear. They patrolled the borders, skirmishing with raiders and learning new tactics from the Mitanni themselves. How to ride horses better, how to use chariots in battle. "We'll need these skills someday," the old soldiers told the young ones. Mark my words. During these dark years, leaders like Ereshkigal II learned to survive by being clever, not bold. He repaired temples, not to glorify himself, but to keep his people's spirits up. He negotiated with Mitanni overlords, giving them just enough tribute to keep them happy, but never so much that his own people starved. "A wise man bends," he told his council, "so he doesn't break." Merchant families, like the house of Puzur-Ishtar, became masters of adaptation. When the Mitanni demanded taxes on every transaction, they kept two sets of records, one for the tax collectors with smaller profits, and one hidden away with the truth. They traded with everyone: Mitanni nobles, Babylonian merchants, even mountain tribes making themselves too useful to be ignored. "Friendship is good for business," the patriarch of the family would say, even with enemies. And in the quiet of temple archives, scribes studied the past. They read about Shamshi-Adad's conquests, about the roads he built, the armies he trained. They copied his laws, his strategies, his belief that Ashur wanted them to rule. "This isn't the end," they wrote in the margins of their texts. Just a pause. By 1400 BCE, the pause was coming to an end. The Mitanni were weakening, torn by internal fights and wars with the Hittites to the west. Babylon, too, was struggling. The Assyrians could feel it. The wind was changing. A young scribe in Ashur's temple, copying an old inscription of Shamshi-Adad, paused and looked up. Outside, he heard the sound of horses, Assyrian horses, not Mitanni ones. He smiled. Maybe, he thought, the time was coming to stop bending. to stand tall again. The whispers of ambition, which had never truly died, began to grow louder. Soon they would be shouts. The air along the Tigris tasted different by the 14th century. BCE, it carried less of the heavy silence of subjugation and more of the sharp, electric tang of possibility. The Mitanni, once so powerful they could command tribute from Ashur, were faltering. Their kings quarreled, their armies stretched thin from wars with the Hittites, their grip on northern Mesopotamia loosening like a worn rope. For the Assyrians, who had waited 4 centuries in the shadows, the moment they had whispered about was arriving got, can you feel it? That slow, building thrill when a long winter finally turns toward spring. The Assyrians felt it. Farmers noticed their Mitanni overseers checking less often. Traders reported that caravans from distant lands were once again seeking out Assyrian markets, not just Mitanni ones. Priests in Ashur's temple observed that the incense seemed to burn brighter, as if the god himself were leaning forward. Eager dot, it was Ashur-uballit I who struck the first spark. Ascending to the throne around 1363 BCE, he did something no Assyrian ruler had dared in generations. He stopped pretending to be a humble servant of foreign kings. He took the title Great King, a bold claim that sent ripples through the diplomatic circles of the ancient world. When he wrote to the Egyptian Pharaoh Amenhotep III, he didn't beg for favor. He addressed him as an equal. "I am a great king, your brother," his letter declared. To everyone's shock, the pharaoh didn't dispute it. This wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. Ashur-uballit understood that power grows from belief in oneself, belief in one's purpose. He sent gifts to Egyptian courts, fine textiles woven in Assyrian workshops, silver from Anatolian mines that his merchants still controlled, even a princess to marry into the pharaonic family. These weren't bribes. They were reminders. Assyria was back, but reminders alone weren't enough. The Mitanni might be weak, but they were still dangerous. So Ashur-uballit built an army, not the ragtag militia of earlier times, but a professional force trained year-round, equipped with the latest weapons. Iron, once rare, was now mined in the mountains north of Ashur, and Assyrian smiths had mastered the art of forging it into blades that stayed sharp longer than bronze, into spears that could pierce the thickest armor. Imagine a blacksmith's workshop in Ashur during these years. The air is thick with the smell of coal and molten metal. A smith heats an iron rod until it glows cherry red, then hammers it on an anvil, sparks flying like stars. His apprentice pumps the bellows, sweat dripping from his brow. "This will cut through Mitanni shields," the smith says, holding up the finished sword. Ashur wills it. Ashur-uballit also looked to the horizon for allies. When a succession crisis erupted in Babylon, he backed one claimant to the throne, sending troops to help him seize power. In return, the new Babylonian king recognized Assyrian independence and even paid tribute, a symbolic reversal of centuries of humiliation. For the first time in memory, Assyrian soldiers marched through the streets of Babylon, not as prisoners or servants, but as conquerors. When Ashur-uballit died, his son Enlil-nirari picked up the torch. He didn't just defend Assyria, he expanded it. His armies pushed deeper into former Mitanni lands, capturing cities that had once mocked Assyrian weakness. Each victory brought wealth, grain from fertile fields, livestock from rich pastures, skilled craftsmen who were put to work in Assyrian workshops. But Enlil-nirari was more than a warrior. He was a builder of systems. He divided the conquered lands into districts, each governed by an official appointed directly from Ashur. These officials weren't local nobles, They were Assyrian loyalists, rotated every few years to prevent them from growing too powerful. No one should forget who holds the whip, Enlil told his council. He also formalized the laws. The Middle Assyrian Law Code, as it would later be known, wasn't just a list of rules. It was a declaration of order. It spelled out punishments for theft, murder, adultery, even lazy soldiers. A noble who kills a commoner pays a fine, one law reads. A commoner who strikes a noble dies. It was harsh, but it was clear. Everyone knew where they stood and what happened if they stepped out of line. Then came Tiglath-Pileser I, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with Assyrian might. Ascending to the throne around 1115 BCE, he took the empire's expansion to new heights. His armies crossed the Euphrates River, a boundary that had once seemed unbreakable, and marched into Syria. City after city fell, 60 by his own count. He boasted of chasing enemies like birds, of burning their villages and carrying their people back to Assyria as prisoners. But Tiglath-Pileser didn't just destroy, he rebuilt. The prisoners he took weren't killed. They were resettled in Assyrian lands, put to work farming, building, or weaving. A farmer from Syria might find himself tending fields outside Ashur, his children growing up speaking Assyrian, his grandchildren forgetting where their family had come from. It was a clever form of control. Mix the peoples, and they'll never unite against you. He also invested in infrastructure. Roads were built to connect distant provinces, wide enough for armies and caravans. Way stations were established every 30 kilometers, where messengers could swap horses and rest, ensuring that news from the farthest borders reached Ashur in just 2 weeks. Speed unheard of in the ancient world. Ashur has given me dominion over all lands, Tiglath-Pileser declared in his inscriptions. From the rising of the sun to its setting, all people shall bow to him and to me, his servant. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a vision. A world united under Assyrian rule, bound together by roads, laws, and the unshakable belief that they were bringing order to chaos. The temples, too, felt the change. Ashur's temple in the capital was expanded, its walls decorated with scenes of the king's victories. Priests composed new hymns, praising Ashur as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and Tiglath-Pileser as his mighty weapon. Religion and warfare, once separate, now marched hand in hand. By the end of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, Assyria was no longer a mere kingdom. It was an empire. Its borders stretched from the Armenian mountains to the Persian Gulf, from the Tigris to the Mediterranean coast. Traders from 3 continents haggled in its markets. Scribes in its schools copied not just Assyrian texts, but works from across the known world, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Yet for all its strength, this empire still had cracks. The Arameans, a nomadic people from the deserts west of Mesopotamia, raided Assyrian lands, their hit-and-run tactics frustrating even the best armies. Conquered peoples simmered with resentment, waiting for their chance to rebel. And the empire's wealth depended on constant expansion. How long could that last? But for now, in the fading light of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, the Assyrians allowed themselves to dream. A scribe in Ashur's library, copying a list of the king's conquests, smiled as he wrote the final entry. The world is ours for Ashur. Wills it. The spark, once rekindled, had become a flame. And flames, as history would show, can either warm or consume. The sun hung low over the Tigris, casting long shadows over a land that was no longer just a collection of cities, but a colossus. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria had outgrown its earlier boundaries, stretching like a great beast across Mesopotamia. Its muscles of iron and its veins of roads binding distant lands into a single pulsing entity. This was no accident. It was the work of kings who understood that a giant needs both strength to conquer and sinews to hold itself together. Have you ever watched a city rise from nothing? Not a village growing gradually, but a deliberate creation, built to impress, to intimidate, to command. That is what Ashurnasirpal II did when he founded Kalhu, modern Nimrod, as his new capital around 883 BCE. He didn't just build houses, he raised a palace with walls covered in alabaster reliefs, each one telling a story. The king leading, his armies, enemies cowering before him, tribute bearers from distant lands offering gold and ivory. Walk through the gates of Kalhu, and you'd feel the weight of empire. The main entrance was flanked by colossal statues, human-headed lions with wings, called Lamassu guardians that seemed to say, "Enter here only if you know your place." Inside, the throne room could hold 1,000 people. Its ceiling, painted to look like the night sky, its floor inlaid with tiles depicting scenes of victory. Ashurnasirpal didn't just live here, he performed kingship, holding lavish banquets that lasted for 10 days, feeding nearly 70,000 guests to show off his wealth. "I am the King of Kings," his inscriptions roared. "The world is my table." But Ashurnasirpal was more than a showman. He was a strategist, and his greatest weapon wasn't just his army. It was his ability to rearrange the map of people. When he conquered a city, he didn't just take its treasure, he moved its people. Thousands of men, women, and children from Syria, Armenia, and northern Mesopotamia were forced to pack their few belongings and march to new homes in Assyria. A potter from Damascus might find himself working in a workshop outside Kalhu. A farmer from the Armenian highlands might end up tilling fields along the Tigris. Why move people around? Ashurnasirpal knew that strangers don't rebel together. If you take a community and scatter it among people who speak different languages, who worship different gods, at least at first, they're less likely to rise up. And it worked. These new settlers brought their skills with them. Syrian weavers taught Assyrians new patterns. Armenian metalworkers shared techniques for forging stronger iron. The empire didn't just conquer, it absorbed. Turning diversity into strength. Iron, of course, was the backbone of that strength. Assyrian smiths had mastered the art of working it, creating swords that could cut through bronze like butter, spears that could pierce armor, and chariots with iron fittings that outlasted any enemies. The mountains north of Ashur were full of iron ore, and Ashurnasirpal built mines and smelters to get at it, turning raw rock into the tools of empire. "With iron we shall break all who oppose us," he told his generals. When Ashurnasirpal died, his son Shalmaneser III picked up his father's sword and his map. For 35 years, he led his armies almost every year, pushing Assyria's borders, west to the Mediterranean, north into Armenia, and south toward Babylon. His greatest victory came in 853 BCE at the Battle of Karkar, where he faced a coalition of 12 kings, including the ruler of Damascus and the king of Israel, who had banded together to stop him. Imagine the battlefield: 70,000 soldiers, chariots, thundering, archers loosing arrows that darkened the sky. The coalition fought fiercely, but Assyria's iron weapons and disciplined formations proved too much. Shalmaneser didn't destroy them all, but he broke their spirit. They fled like sheep, he boasted, leaving their weapons and their pride behind. But Shalmaneser knew that an empire can't run on victories alone. It needs roads to move armies, to carry tribute, to send messages. So he built them, thousands of miles of them, paved with stone in some places, packed earth in others, but all wide enough for 2 chariots to pass. Every 30 kilometers, he set up a way station, a fork with stables, a storehouse, and a garrison of soldiers. A messenger carrying news from the Mediterranean coast could swap his tired horse for a fresh one, grab a meal, and be on his way, covering 150 kilometers a day. These roads weren't just for messengers. They were for tax collectors. 2. Shalmaneser standardized the empire's taxes, sending scribes to every province to count the fields, the livestock, the workshops. A farmer will pay 1/10 of his grain, the law stated. A merchant will give 1 silver shekel for every 10 he earns. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. If you know how much wealth a province has, you know how to keep it in line. The taxes poured into Kalhu, funding more palaces, more temples, more armies. Shalmaneser built a monument called the Black Obelisk, a 4-sided stone covered in reliefs of tribute bearers, the king of Israel bowing before him, offering gold and silver, Arabian chiefs bringing camels and spices, even a delegation from distant Egypt bearing exotic gifts. All the world pays homage to me, the obelisk declared. But for all its power, the empire had a flaw. It was hungry. It needed constant conquest to feed its armies, to fill its treasuries, to keep its people employed. When Shalmaneser's armies didn't return with plunder, taxes went up and resentment grew. The Arameans, those nomadic raiders from the desert, still slipped through Assyrian lines, burning villages and vanishing before the army could catch them. And in the far north, a new power was rising, Urartu, a kingdom in the Armenian mountains that would one day challenge Assyria for control of the region. Yet, in the golden light of Shalmaneser's reign, these problems seemed small. A scribe in Kalhu's archives, copying a list of the year's conquests, smiled as he wrote, "The empire grows, and so does Ashur's glory, iron and road strength and connection. Together, they had turned Assyria into a giant." But giants, as the Assyrians would learn, can stumble. For now, though, the giant stood tall, its shadow stretching across the known world. The sun still rose over Assyria's palaces and provinces, but by the late 8th century BCE, its light carried a chill. The empire, which had stretched so confidently from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains, now moved with a heaviness, like a great beast with a thorn in its paw, still dangerous, but slowing, distracted by the pain. The cracks weren't yet visible to everyone, but to those who knew where to look, the soldiers on the borders, the scribes balancing the treasury books, the farmers in the villages, it was clear the giant was starting to stumble. Imagine standing on a watchtower along Assyria's western frontier, where the desert meets the fertile plains. The wind carries the scent of sand and date palms, but also something sharper, fear. For years, this land had been peaceful, protected by Assyria's ironclad armies. But now, at dusk, you might see them shadows on the horizon, mounted warriors, with spears, their hair blowing wild. They are the Iranians, nomads from the deserts of Syria, and they have learned a terrible lesson. Assyria's armies are powerful, but they are not everywhere. The Arameans didn't fight like the kings of Babylon or the Hittites. They didn't march in formation, with banners flying, ready for a grand battle. They came quietly, in small bands, slipping through the night to raid a village, steal cattle, set fire to granaries, and vanish back into the desert before the Assyrian garrison could saddle their horses. They are like locusts, a border. Guard complains to his captain, "You swat them, but more come. We can't guard every village, every field. And it was true. Assyria's army was built for conquest, for storming cities, for clashing with other armies on open ground. But this new kind of war, this endless game of cat and mouse, wore them down. Soldiers grew tired of chasing phantoms. Villagers, fearing for their lives, abandoned their homes, moving into fortified towns and leaving their fields to wither. The grain that once fed the empire's armies grew scarce. Trade caravans, once a common sight on the roads, now traveled in large groups, hiring mercenaries for protection, and even then, many never reached their destination. While the borders burned, trouble was brewing at the heart of the empire. The old king Ashurnasirpal II's grandson lay dying, and his sons squabbled like starving dogs over the throne. "I am the firstborn," one declared. "The crown is mine by right. Father chose me to rule," another shouted, waving a possibly forged letter. For 6 long years, Assyria tears itself in civil war. Provinces declared loyalty to one prince or the other. Generals turned on each other. While they fought, the Arameans raided deeper into Assyrian territory. Babylon, ever waiting for a chance to break free, began to whisper of rebellion. When the dust settled, one prince emerged victorious, but the empire he inherited was a shadow of its former self. The treasury was empty, spent on hiring mercenaries and bribing allies. The army, once feared, was demoralized. And the people? They were angry. Taxes had been raised again and again to fund the war, while their villages burned and their children went hungry. What good is this empire if it can't protect us? A farmer asks as he buries his daughter, killed in an Aramean raid. It was a question no one could answer easily. Worst of all, the empire's lifeblood plunder was drying up. For centuries, Assyria had grown fat on the wealth of conquered lands. Gold from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, textiles from Babylon. But now, there were no new lands to conquer. The easy targets had been taken. The remaining kingdoms, Urartu in the north, Egypt in the south, were strong, with armies that could stand against Assyria's. Without new victories, without new treasures, how would the empire pay its soldiers, feed its people, maintain its roads and palaces? It was into this chaos that Tiglath-Pileser III stepped around 745 BCE. He was not a prince, but a general, a man who had seen the empire's weaknesses up close, who knew how to fix them. "Enough," he declared, seizing the throne in a coup. "Ashur's empire will not fall on my watch." Tiglath-Pileser's reforms were like a cold shower for a sleeping giant. First, he rebuilt the army. No more relying on lazy nobles to raise troops when needed. He created a standing army with soldiers paid and trained year-round. He divided them into specialized units, archers who could rain arrows from a distance, heavy infantry to breach city walls, cavalry to chase down raiders like the Arameans. "You will be the sharpest blade in Ashur's hand," he told them. Next, he reorganized the provinces. Gone were the days of letting local kings rule as vassals, biding their time to rebel. Tiglath-Pileser replaced them with governors, men. He chose men loyal to him who were rotated every few years to prevent them from growing too powerful. He sent scribes to every corner of the empire, counting every field, every sheep, every potter's wheel, so he knew exactly how much tax each province could pay. No more guessing, no more cheating. "The empire will live on order, not luck," he said. He also tackled the Aramean problem. Instead of chasing them, he built forts along the frontier, small but strong, manned by his new cavalry units. When the Arameans raided, the forts would send riders to warn nearby villages, and then chase the raiders down. using their own speed against them. Slowly, the raids diminished. Villagers returned to their fields. Trade caravans started moving again. For a time, it worked. Tiglath-Pileser marched his new army north, defeating Urartu. He marched south, reasserting control over Babylon. He even marched west, capturing Damascus and adding its wealth to his treasury. The empire breathed again. Scribes wrote of a new dawn, of Ashur's favor returning. But was it enough? Look closer. The standing army cost a fortune to maintain. The new taxes, while efficient, made the people resentful. The Arameans were quiet, but not gone. They waited in the desert, like wolves circling a campfire. And the old hunger for conquest remained. Tiglath-Pileser's successors would take his reforms and push them further, expanding the empire to its greatest size. But at what cost? Stand in the marketplace of Kalhu during this recovery, and you might hear a merchant say, "Things are better now." But you might also hear an old woman mutter, "It's the same storm, just taking a breath." She was right. The shadows on the horizon hadn't gone. They were just waiting. The sun blazed at its zenith over Mesopotamia in the 7th century BCE, casting a golden glow that seemed to bless every corner of Assyria's empire. This was no ordinary noon. It was the high noon of a civilization that had climbed from a riverside. Settlement to a dominion spanning 3 continents. From the fertile banks of the Nile to the rugged mountains of Iran, from the bustling markets of Syria to the quiet villages along the Tigris, the name Assyria was spoken with a mix of awe and fear. This was the empire at its brightest, where military might and cultural splendor walked hand in hand, as if the gods themselves had paused to admire their handiwork. Imagine standing at the gates of Nineveh, the empire's glittering capital. The city stretched for miles, its walls so tall they seemed to touch the sky, topped with guards in polished armor who scanned the horizon for any sign of trouble. Inside, the streets bustled with life. Merchants from Egypt haggling over spices, craftsmen from Babylon shaping clay into intricate pots, scholars from Greece and Persia hurrying to the royal library, their scrolls tucked under their arms. Air smelled of baking bread from neighborhood ovens, of incense from Ashur's temple, and of the sweet, earthy scent of date palms that lined the canals crisscrossing the city. Nineveh was more than a capital, it was a statement. King Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BCE, had rebuilt it from the ground up, determined to make it the greatest city the world had ever seen. He dug a network of aqueducts, some stretching over 50 miles, to bring fresh water from the mountains, turning the desert around the city into lush gardens. Even the rivers bowed to Assyria, he boasted in his inscriptions. And looking at the fountains that gushed in every square, it was hard to disagree. Sennacherib was a warrior at heart, but he knew that an empire needed more than swords to endure. When he captured Babylon, a city that had rebelled more than once, he didn't just destroy it, though he did tear down its walls in a fit of anger. Later, he rebuilt it, grander than before, with temples to both Babylon's gods and Ashur, a gesture that said, "We conquer, but we also preserve." It was a clever move. Babylonians, who had resented Assyrian rule, began to see themselves as part of something larger, their culture honored even as their independence vanished. Sennacherib's greatest joy was his army. He had learned from his father's reforms, turning it into a machine of precision. His soldiers didn't just march, they engineered victory. When they laid siege to a city, they built ramps of earth to climb its walls, used battering rams to smash its gates, and even dug tunnels under its foundations to make them collapse. "We do not just attack," Sennacherib told his generals. We outthink our enemies. In 701 BCE, he marched on Jerusalem, a small but stubborn city in Judah that had dared to rebel. Instead of storming its walls, which would have cost thousands of lives, he surrounded it, cut off its water, and waited. The king of Judah, Hezekiah, sent word begging for mercy, offering tribute. Sennacherib accepted, though he made sure his victory was carved into the walls of his palace, a reminder to all who saw it. Even the distant lands bow to Assyria. When Sennacherib died, his son Esarhaddon took the throne, and he reached even further. Egypt, that ancient land of pharaohs and pyramids, had long been a prize too far for Assyrian kings. But Esarhaddon saw weakness there, a divided kingdom with rival pharaohs fighting for power. In 671 BCE, he led his army across the Sinai Desert, a feat that had once seemed impossible, and captured Memphis, Egypt's capital. Imagine the scene. Assyrian soldiers, their iron weapons glinting in the Egyptian sun, marching through the streets of Memphis, past pyramids and statues of pharaohs. The people stared, shocked, as their own king was led away in chains. But Esarhaddon, like his father, knew when to be gentle. He installed a puppet ruler who spoke Egyptian and honored local customs, while making sure tribute gold from Nubia, ivory from the Sudan, exotic animals for the royal zoo flowed back to Nineveh. Egypt is not an enemy, he declared, but a member of Ashur's family. Yet the true crown jewel of this golden age came with Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 669 to 631 BCE. He was a different kind of king, not just a warrior, but a scholar. While his armies continued to conquer, he destroyed the Elamite kingdom in Iran, ending a centuries-old rivalry. His heart lay in the written word. "I love knowledge," he wrote, "as a farmer loves his fields." And so he built the world's first royal library in Nineveh. It wasn't just a room with books. It was a vast collection of over 30,000 clay tablets, gathered from every corner of the empire. Scribes traveled to Babylon, to Ur, to Hattusa, copying texts, epic poems like the Epic of Gilgamesh, medical recipes. To cure a headache, mix poppy seeds with honey, legal codes, astronomical observations, even love songs. Walk into Ashurbanipal's library, and you'd see scribes hunched over their work tables, their styluses scratching into wet clay. One copies a Babylonian creation myth, careful to preserve every word. Another translates an Egyptian medical text into Assyrian, noting, "This works for snake bites tested by our healers." A third organizes the tablets by subject, labeling each shelf: history, religion, science, magic. Ashurbanipal himself often visited, sitting with the scholars, asking questions, debating the meaning of old texts. "These tablets are my legacy," he said. "Wars end, kings die, but knowledge lasts." The library wasn't just for show. It was a tool of empire. By gathering the wisdom of conquered peoples, Ashurbanipal was saying, "We don't just rule you, we understand you." It helped Assyria govern its diverse territories, using local laws where they worked, adapting them where they didn't. A judge in Egypt could refer to Assyrian copies of Egyptian laws. A farmer in Syria could use Babylonian irrigation techniques, preserved in the library's tablets. During this golden age, Assyria felt invincible. Its armies were unbeatable, its cities unmatched, its scholars the envy of the world. Traders from as far as India and Greece flocked to Nineveh, bringing silk and spices, and leaving with Assyrian iron tools and textiles. The royal palace hosted feasts where guests ate from gold plates, listened to musicians from every corner of the empire, and watched acrobats from Egypt perform daring stunts. This is what Ashur intended, the priests declared, a world united in prosperity. But even at high noon, shadows begin to stretch. Ashurbanipal's library held not just wisdom, but warnings, old texts telling of empires that grew too large, that forgot their roots, that collapsed when their people grew weary. Did he read them? Perhaps. But in the glow of his success, they must have seemed like stories from a different world. For now, though, the sun shone bright. Nineveh's gates stayed open, its markets full, its libraries busy. The empire was at its peak, a monument to what humanity could achieve when ambition, skill, and a little bit of luck came together. Who could have guessed that this noon would be so short? The sun that had blazed so brightly over Assyria's golden age began to dip toward the horizon in Ashurbanipal's later years. At first, the change was subtle, a faint chill in the air, a shadow stretching longer than it should. But by the 650s BCE, the cracks in the empire's walls were no longer hidden. They spiderwebbed across provinces and palaces alike, fed by greed, resentment, and the simple weight of a dominion that had grown too large to hold itself together. Let us start with the family, for even empires are undone by the same quarrels that tear apart households. Ashurbanipal, for all his wisdom, had made a fateful choice. He appointed his younger brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, to rule Babylon as his deputy. "Watch over our southern lands," he told him, "as a son watches over his father's house." For a time, it worked. Shamash-shum-ukin governed with skill, respecting local customs, repairing temples, and sending tribute north to Nineveh. But Babylon was no mere province. It was a city with a soul of its own, a history of kings and conquests that stretched back millennia. And Shamash-shum-ukin, standing in the shadow of his brother's glory, began to wonder, why should I rule in his name when I could rule in my own? In 652 BCE, the question became a rebellion. Shamash-shum-ukin declared himself king of Babylon, not just a deputy, and called on the peoples of the south to rise with him. "Assyria has drained our lands, stolen our wealth, and mocked our gods," he proclaimed. "Now is the time to break free." His words found eager ears. Babylonians, still bitter over Sennacherib's earlier destruction of their city, flocked to his banner. Elamites, long enemies of Assyria, sent troops to aid him. Even some Assyrian nobles, resentful of Ashurbanipal's power, secretly supported the revolt. What followed was 4 years of civil war, brother against brother, Assyrian against Assyrian. Ashurbanipal's armies laid siege to Babylon, but the city's walls, rebuilt stronger than before, held. His soldiers, once unbeatable, grew tired of fighting their own kin. "We kill Babylonians today, but they are our neighbors, our trading partners," a veteran grumbled to his captain. "What are we fighting for?" The cost was staggering. Fields lay untended as farmers fled the fighting, leading to famine. The treasury, fattened by Egyptian gold and Elamite plunder, emptied to fund the war. While Ashurbanipal's generals focused on Babylon, Aramean raiders slipped back across the western borders, and Urartu reclaimed lands in the north. By the time Babylon fell in 648 BC, its walls breached, its streets bloodied. Ashurbanipal had won, but the victory tasted like ash. He executed his brother, destroyed much of the city, and scattered its people, but the damage was done. The empire had torn itself apart, and everyone could see the wounds. If the civil war was a knife in the empire's side, the resentment of conquered peoples was a slow poison. For centuries, Assyria had ruled through fear and force, relocating entire populations, taxing provinces into poverty, replacing local gods with Ashur. Now, that poison began to work. In Egypt, a local ruler named Santik I drove out Assyrian garrisons, declaring independence. "We have bowed long enough," he told his people. In Syria, city-states that had once paid tribute now closed their gates to Assyrian tax collectors. Even in the heartland, farmers grumbled as taxes rose again to pay for the war, their children going hungry while Ashurbanipal's scribes copied old texts in Nineveh's library. "We are not Assyrians," a Babylonian exile whispered to his son as they worked as forced laborers in Nineveh. "We are Babylonians, and one day we will go home." That whisper, multiplied 1,000,000 times, became a roar. Worst of all, new enemies were gathering on the horizon, enemies who had learned from Assyria's own playbook. To the east, in the mountains of Iran, a people called the Medes had grown. Strong, once fragmented into warring tribes, they had united under a king named Cyaxares, who studied Assyrian tactics, forged iron weapons, and built a cavalry to match the empire's best. "Assyria is a tree with rotting roots," he told his warriors. "Soon the wind will blow, and it will fall." To the south, in the ruins of Babylon, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar saw opportunity. He had survived Ashurbanipal's wrath, fleeing to the marshes when the city fell. Now he emerged, rallying Babylonians to his cause. "I will rebuild our city," he promised, "and we will never bow to Assyria again." What made this alliance deadly was not just their strength, but their wisdom. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar did not rush to war. They waited, watching as Assyria staggered from the civil war. They traded with each other, sharing weapons and information. They even married their children to seal the pact, ensuring their peoples would fight as one. "The lion and the wolf do not hunt together," a Median elder warned, but Cyaxares smiled. "They do, and they share the same prey." By 630 BCE, when Ashurbanipal died, the trap was set. His successors were weak, bickering over the throne, just as he and his brother had. The army, its ranks thinned by war and desertion, could no longer patrol all the empire's borders. Provinces stopped sending tribute, declaring themselves independent. The roads that had once bound the empire together now carried enemy armies. Instead of merchants. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar marched on Babylon, capturing it without a fight. The people opened their gates, cheering as he entered. "Our king has returned," they shouted. A year later, Cyaxares led his Median warriors across the Zagros Mountains, capturing Assyrian forts and driving toward Nineveh. The Assyrians fought back, of course. They still had iron weapons, still knew how to build siege engines. But they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and most of all tired. A soldier from Kalhu, drafted to defend Nineveh, wrote to his wife, "The enemy is everywhere. I do not think I will come home." The cracks in the walls, once small, had become chasms. The empire that had ruled the world for 3 centuries was unraveling, thread by thread, as the sun sank lower. The sun dipped low over the Tigris one last time, painting the sky in hues of blood and bronze. It was 612 BCE, and the greatest city of the ancient world, Nineveh, stood at the edge of the abyss. For 3 months, the combined armies of the Medes and the new Babylonian king, Nabopolassar, had surrounded it, their campfires flickering like a ring of stars around the city's massive walls. Those walls, once a symbol of invincibility tall enough to block out the sun, thick enough to withstand any battering ram, now looked thin, fragile. as if a strong wind might blow them down. Imagine standing on those walls as the sun set. Behind you, the city lay quiet, but it was a tense quiet, like the hush before a storm. In the distance, you could hear the faint roar of the enemy camp, the clatter of weapons, the shouts of commanders, the lowing of cattle being prepared for supper. Closer by, you might see a mother clutching her child, hurrying to a cellar for safety. A priest, his robe stained with dust, kneels in the street, praying to Ashur to spare the city. A soldier, his armor dented from weeks of fighting, leans against a tower, staring at the enemy lines with a look that is half anger, half resignation. Nineveh had withstood sieges before. It had been sacked by the Babylonians in the distant past, but it had always risen again, stronger than before. This time was different. The army outside was not a ragtag band of raiders. It was a machine, forged in the fires of hatred for Assyrian rule. The Medes, led by Cyaxares, had learned Assyria's own tactics. They built ramps of earth to climb the walls, used iron-tipped battering rams to smash the gates, and dug tunnels under the foundations to make them crumble. The Babylonians under Nabopolassar brought their own expertise. They knew how to starve a city into submission, cutting off the aqueducts that Sennacherib had built with such pride, turning Nineveh's lush gardens into dust. Inside the city, King Sinsharishkan, Assurbanipal's grandson, desperately tried to rally his people. "Remember who we are," he shouted from the palace steps. "We are Assyrians. We do not surrender." But his words fell flat. The army was exhausted, its ranks thinned by desertion and death. The people were hungry, drinking water from stagnant pools, eating rats and weeds to survive. The once mighty Assyrian war machine had run out of fuel. On a fateful day in late summer, the walls finally gave way. A section near the eastern gate, weakened by weeks of battering and tunneling, collapsed with a thunderous roar, sending clouds of dust into the sky. The enemy poured through the breach, their battle cries echoing through the streets. "For Babylon! For Media!" they shouted as they cut down anyone who stood in their way. The palace was their prize. Sinsharishkan, refusing to be captured, set fire to his own home, burning with his treasures rather than face defeat. The flames spread quickly, consuming the alabaster reliefs that told the story of Assyria's glory, melting the gold plates that lined the throne room, turning the library's clay tablets into shards. Ashurbanipal's great collection of knowledge poems, laws, medical texts was scattered, some buried under rubble, some carried away as trophies, most lost forever. Outside, the city burned. Temples to Ashur were sacked, their statues of the god dragged through the streets and smashed. Markets where merchants from 3 continents had traded were looted and set ablaze. Homes where families had lived for generations were reduced to ash. The Tigris, once a lifeline, ran red with blood. Sinsharishkan's son, Ashur-uballit II, managed to escape with a small band of soldiers, fleeing west to Haran, a city that had long been a loyal outpost of the empire. For 3 years, he held out, dreaming of rebuilding what had been lost. But in 609 BCE, the Babylonian-Median alliance tracked him down. Haran fell, and with it, the last flicker of Assyrian independence. Ashur-uballit vanished into history, his fate unknown, killed in battle, captured, or perhaps fleeing into the desert, a king without a kingdom. What was left? Ruins. Nineveh, once home to 100,000 people, became a ghost town, its streets overgrown with weeds, its palaces home to jackals and owls. The great aqueducts crumbled. Their stones used to build villages elsewhere. The clay tablets that survived The fire lay buried, waiting for centuries to be rediscovered. Stand in those ruins today, and you can almost hear the echoes, the laughter of children in the palace gardens, the clatter of chariots on the streets, the scribes' styluses scratching. Into clay, the priests' chants in Ashur's temple. But all that remains is the wind, blowing through broken walls, and the occasional fragment of a tablet, half buried in the dirt, a silent witness to a civilization that rose like a meteor, burned brightly for centuries, then vanished into the night. The last sunset over Assyria had come, and as the darkness fell, it carried with it the end of an era. The dust of Nineveh settled slowly, like a blanket covering a forgotten secret. For centuries, the ruins of Assyria's capital lay hidden, their stones scavenged for other buildings, their stories whispered only in the margins of ancient texts. But dust, as it turns out, is a poor keeper of secrets. It preserves more than it buries, and the legacy of Assyria, though hidden, was never truly gone. It lingered in laws, in tools, in stories, in the very way empires would come to rule. You ever picked up a stone from a riverbed and wondered where it came from? Maybe it was once part of a mountain, or a temple, or a wall that guarded a kingdom. That's what Assyria's legacy is like. Pieces of a broken empire, scattered across time, shaping the world without anyone noticing. Let's start with how empires rule. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered the Near East a century after Nineveh fell, he didn't just tear down what Assyria had built. He borrowed it. The Persians divided their vast empire into provinces, called satrapies, each run by a governor appointed by the king, just like Assyria's provinces, with their rotating governors to prevent rebellion. They standardized taxes, sending scribes to count fields and flocks, just as Tiglath-Pileser III had done. They even used Assyria's roads and way stations, speeding messengers across their dominion with the same efficiency that once carried Assyrian orders. Why reinvent the wheel? Cyrus might have thought. When the wheel already works, this borrowing wasn't accidental. Persian officials had studied Assyrian archives, copied their administrative texts, and even hired former Assyrian scribes to teach them how to manage a multi-continental empire. A letter from a Persian satrap to the king, found in a later archive, could almost have been written by an Assyrian governor. I have collected the tribute from the western lands. I have suppressed a rebellion in the mountains. All is in order. The words were Persian, but the system was Assyrian. Military minds, too, kept Assyria's lessons close. The Greeks, who later fought the Persians, learned from the ruins of Assyrian battlefields. They studied the ramps and battering rams that had brought down Nineveh's walls, adapting them to storm their own enemies' cities. Roman generals, centuries later, read accounts of Assyrian cavalry tactics, how they used speed and archers on horseback to outmaneuver slower armies, and copied them, turning their own cavalry into a fearsome force. Even the Mongols, 1,000 years after Assyria's fall, employed the same trick of relocating conquered peoples to prevent rebellion, a strategy perfected by Ashurnasirpal II. Conquest is easy, a Mongol leader once said. Ruling is hard, and the Assyrians knew how to rule. But perhaps the most precious legacy lay buried in the dirt of Nineveh, the clay tablets of Ashurbanibal's library. When archaeologists dug into the ruins in the 19th century, they found thousands of them broken, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palace, but still readable. Among them was something extraordinary, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story ever written, a tale of a king's quest for immortality. Without Assyria's scribes, who copied and preserved it, this story, with its lessons about love, loss, and the meaning of life, might have vanished forever. Other tablets revealed more medical recipes. Grind this herb with honey to cure a fever. Astronomical observations. On the 15th day, the moon will eclipse the sun. Legal codes that would later influence the laws of Babylon and Persia. A tablet describing how to build a siege tower with measurements, materials, and even instructions for moving it reads like a modern engineering manual. These weren't just old stones. They were windows into how people thought, worked, and solved problems 2,700 years ago. Religion and law, too, carried a serious echo. The Hebrew Bible, written centuries after Assyria's fall, remembers the empire as a symbol of divine judgment, a powerful nation that punished wrongdoing, but also fell when it grew too proud. Woe to Assyria, the prophet Isaiah wrote, the rod of my anger. This wasn't just history. It was a moral lesson. Even the mightiest empires are subject to a higher power. Christian writers later picked up this theme, using Assyria as a warning about the dangers of arrogance. Assyria's laws, with their focus on order and harsh punishments for wrongdoing, seeped into the legal traditions of the Near East. The idea that a king should uphold justice for all people, a phrase repeated in Assyrian royal inscriptions, would later appear in the laws of Babylon, Persia, and even Rome. A judge in a small town in Syria, a century after Nineveh fell, might not have known he was enforcing Assyrian ideas, but the principles he followed, punish theft, protect the weak, honor contracts, had been written in clay by Assyrian scribes. Even the way we remember the past owes something to Assyria. Ashurbanipal's library wasn't just a collection of books. It was an attempt to preserve knowledge for future generations. To say, we were here and we mattered. That impulse to collect, to record, to ensure that our stories outlive us, is something every culture since has shared. When you visit a museum or read a history book, you're following in the footsteps of those Assyrian scribes who believed that memory is the most lasting legacy. Stand in the British Museum today, and you can see pieces of that legacy. A Lamassu statue from Nineveh, its human head and lion bodies still imposing. A fragment of the Black Obelisk showing the king of Israel bowing to Shalmaneser III. A tablet from Ashurbanipal's library, its cuneiform symbols still sharp, telling a story that would otherwise have been lost. These aren't just artifacts. They're proof that Assyria, though gone, never really disappeared. It's in the way. Empires govern, in the stories we tell, in the tools we use to build and fight, in the belief that knowledge is worth preserving. The dust of Nineveh may have covered its palaces, but the empire's spirit, ambitious, innovative, hungry to leave. Its mark lingers still. The campfire crackles low, casting warm light on the faces of those gathered around it. A grandmother, her voice soft with the weight of years, tells a story not of monsters or magic, but of a kingdom that once stretched from sunrise to sunset, then vanished like smoke. They called it Assyria, she says, poking a stick into the flames. And though it's gone, it still speaks to us if we listen. What does it say, you might ask? What can a long-dead empire teach us, sitting here by the fire so many centuries later? More than you'd think. For Assyria's story is not just about kings and battles. It's about us, about the choices all nations, all peoples, must make when power comes their way. Let's start with the first lesson. Strength without wisdom is a sword without a hilt. Assyria had strength in spades. Its armies were the fiercest, its weapons the sharpest, its cities the grandest. But strength alone isn't enough. The Assyrians could conquer a kingdom in a week, but they struggled to rule it for a year. They taxed their subjects until they starved, relocated families until they forgot their roots, mocked local gods until resentment turned to rebellion. We are strong enough to crush them, they thought. But strength can't buy loyalty. It can't make a farmer plant crops when his children are hungry, or a priest pray for your victory when you've destroyed his temple. Contrast that with the Persians, who came after. They borrowed Assyria's army tactics and its provincial system, but they added something new: respect. They let conquered peoples keep their gods, their laws, their ways of life. "We rule your lands," the Persian king Cyrus said, "but we do not erase your souls." And so their empire lasted longer, with far less bloodshed. It's a lesson as old as time. You can lead with fear, or you can lead with fairness. Fear works fast, but fairness works longer. The second lesson? An empire is not a treasure to hoard, but a garden to tend. The Assyrians treated their empire like a treasure chest, something to fill with gold, silver, and captives, then guard with swords. But gardens need water, sunlight, care. You can't just take from them, you have to give back. The Assyrians drained their provinces dry, taking taxes and soldiers and never investing in roads, schools, or wells. When droughts came, or raids, or rebellions, there was nothing left to fall back on. The soil was exhausted, the people angry, the treasury empty. Later empires like Rome learned this the hard way. They too expanded rapidly, but they built aqueducts in their provinces, taught locals to read and write, let them become citizens. "A province that thrives," a Roman general once said, "is a province that stays loyal." It's a simple truth. What you put into your empire is what you get out of it. Third, no empire is too big to fail. Assyria stretched from the Nile to the Iranian mountains, and that was its undoing. Its armies were spread too thin. Its messengers took too long to ride from one end to the other. Its rulers lost touch with the people in distant lands. A rebellion in Babylon might be over before the king in Nineveh even heard about it. A raid in Syria could turn into a war, while generals argued over whose job it was to stop it. Alexander the Great, who dreamed of a world empire like Assyria's, tried to fix this by marrying local princesses, blending Greek culture with Persian, building cities as nodes to connect his vast realm. But even he couldn't outrun the problem. The bigger you get, the harder it is to hold together. Rome split itself into two empires to manage the strain. The Mongols let local rulers stay in charge as long as they paid tribute. No one ever solved the puzzle completely. Assyria's lesson here is humbling. There's a limit to how much any one nation can govern, no matter how smart or strong got forth. Unity starts at home. The Assyrians fell apart, not just because of foreign enemies, but because brothers fought brothers, nobles plotted against kings, and no one could agree on what Assyria even meant. Was it a land for Assyrians only, or a home for everyone under its rule? Shamash Shum-Ukin's rebellion wasn't just about power, it was about identity. And when a people can't agree on who they are, they can't stand together when trouble comes. The best empires, the ones that last, are those that build a we bigger than us versus them. The Persians called it the kingdom of many nations. The Romans said, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, and let people from Spain to Syria claim that title. Assyria never quite got that. They saw themselves as the chosen people, everyone else as subjects. And in the end, that us versus them ate them alive. Finally, even in failure, there is wisdom. Assyria didn't just disappear. It left footprints, roads, laws, stories, ideas that shaped the world long after its palaces crumbled. The way we organize governments, the way armies fight, the way we preserve knowledge in libraries, All these things bear Assyria's mark. Even its mistakes were lessons. How not to tax your people, how not to treat conquered lands, how not to let pride blind you to warning signs. The grandmother stirs the fire, and for a moment, the flames look like the walls of Nineveh, rising and falling. They thought they'd rule forever, she says. But nothing rules forever. Not kings, not empires, not even the strongest among us. What lasts is what we learn, and how we pass it on. Around the fire, a child asks, "Was Assyria bad then?" The grandmother smiles. "No, love, they weren't bad. They were human. They dreamed big, made mistakes, learned hard, like all of us. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. Assyria's story isn't just about an empire. It's about us, our hunger to build, our struggle to govern wisely, our need to remember that even the mightiest among us are just people, trying to do their best. The fire dies down, leaving embers that glow like stars. Somewhere in the dark, a wind blows, carrying the faint echo of Assyrian chariots, of scribes' styluses, of priests praying to Ashur. It's a reminder. The past isn't dead. It's whispering. All we have to do is listen.